Okay, so thank you all of you for joining us today at this workshop, Digital Platform in the Global South, Shaping a Critical Approach. On behalf of the three of us, Tristan MATTELART, Philippe BOUQUILLION, and myself, I would like to say that it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you today. Thanks to our institution for their support to organize this workshop, the LabSIC, the LabSIC, the Carism, and the Laboratoire Passage. And of course, thanks to all our colleagues who have accepted our invitation to participate to this today workshop. We're delighted to see so many familiar faces together here. We know some of you for a long time. We've already been collaborating with most of you as part of previous workshop, colloquium, publication, and we're very eager to exchange more today on this object of study, digital platform, that has been important in our respective research and around which we aim at developing a collective reflection. Despite the abundant literature produced over the past decade on digital platform, numerous gray areas and imbalances exist and need to be addressed. And I will let Tristan in his presentation to come back more precisely on the literature review in a few minutes. An ambition of this workshop is more than to share ongoing works. It's also to create a critical research network on digital platform and federate researchers working on platform and cultural industry in the Global South. While preparing this workshop together, we could see strong connection between our works on digital platform and wanted to identify further and more concretely the links between our theoretical and methodological tools to build this critical approach in view of future projects. So we would like now to present into more details several goals of those 2 days workshop and come back on some essential aspects surrounding the notion of platform and of Global South.
And one of the central objectives of this workshop is to avoid locking these two notions in essentialist approaches. This objective is all the more important as many approaches aim to precisely define the platformization and the characteristics of the platforms. In this regard, research in management sciences and economics is emblematic and reached great success in academic circles, but also among economic decision makers and political leaders. In this research, platforms are approached from the theories of two-sided markets or multi-sided markets. In this perspective, especially that of multi-sided markets, platforms connect affiliated users who are both suppliers and consumers. The contribution of multi-sided platforms, MSP, is therefore to allow direct interaction between these users. Platforms of this type make it possible to maximize the network effect. Maximizing user satisfaction depends, according to this point of view, on the number of users and of their qualities. From this perspective, some of the theorists, including Agiu and Wright, distinguish between real platform, namely that function as MSP, and false platforms, which they call resellers. According to this definition, for example, YouTube would be a platform, but not Netflix. These perspectives, of course, to schematically summarize here, have favored the affirmation of two series of representation. First, they do not focus on the balance of power between platform operators and affiliated users, since MSP, unlike resellers, would only be neutral intermediaries. A very enchanted vision of the platform is then promoted, where platform would be at the service of users and their interaction. They would therefore contribute to the empowerment of users towards the industry. In the case of MSP, remember that according to Agiu and Wright, the direct interaction allowed by MSP mean that the two or more distinct sides retain control over the key terms of the interaction, as opposed to the intermediary taking control of these terms. Second, according to this conception, platform would be universal in scope. They are presented as being valid regardless of the time and the society considered. From this perspective, the platform in the South do not differ from the platform in the North. Likewise, cultural platforms will then have no specificity. In contrast to these approaches, three dimensions seem constitutive of critical approaches and the activities of digital platform in the global South. Yet, those three dimensions are not exhaustive, and few research have articulated them. The first of those critical dimensions explore the geographic, historical, cultural, or linguistic specificities of the territories in which this platform operates. For instance, the grip of informality is firmer in the global South than in the global North. The second dimension of this critical approach consists in taking into account the specificities of content and service proposed by platforms. Thus, cultural platforms have specificities in the same way that cultural industry have specificities in relation to other economic activities, as theory of cultural industry demonstrate. The last of those critical dimensions links the research on digital platform to the logic of transnational capitalism and to the relation of power and domination in which it is embedded. These macro perspectives are articulated with meso and micro approaches, the latter to target individual trajectories.
An approach of those dimensions from the global South is particularly relevant to apprehend the way platforms revive older debates and questions around the relation of inequalities and hegemonies. If here again, it's important to avoid an essentialist approach, the notion of global South bears real interest in the perspective of a critical approach, especially in the analysis of both long-term inequalities and power asymmetry at world scale, as well as local reconfiguration processes at the local scale. The place of socio-economic actor in the global South should not be also underestimated. In the case of SVOD platform in India that we've been more specifically studied, we have observed the constitution of transnational oligopoly, which both strengthen the presence of foreign actors in the Indian digital and audiovisual economy, but also the position of a very small number of Indian actors on the Indian territory and abroad. These approaches seem essential to us in order to be able to contextualize and deconstruct the emergence, the spread, and even the institutionalization of the notions of platform and platformization in the global South.
So, as you understood, this workshop aims at critically assessing the role of digital platforms in the global South. And as Christine stated, there has been a non-negligible literature, a body of literature on this issue in recent years. And we thought it was important to try to map it for introducing this workshop. And that's what I will try to do here, without, of course, intending to be exhaustive. So as this field is quite wide, I will focus my presentation more specifically on the research devoted to the role played by the main US-based platforms in the global South, but excluding the case of Netflix. So as José Van Dijk stated, the early years 2010 marked the peak of a decade of platform euphoria. And this euphoria has permeated a large number of the works that were at that time produced on the subject of digital platforms and the global South. Digital platforms, for example, were described as tools of political democratization of authoritarian countries of the global South. Larry Diamond went as far as to state that Facebook and Twitter constituted liberation technologies thanks to their ability to expand political, social, and economic freedom in the global south. But digital platforms have also been described as tools enhancing economic development in the global south. A report of the World Bank states that thanks to the growth of mobile phones and social media in the global south, ICTs have great promise to reduce poverty, increase productivity, boost economic growth, and so on and so on. These two approaches are very different, but they are based on the same premise. The idea that technological platforms are just neutral technological instruments. Yet platforms are not neutral technological instruments. They are socio-technical constructions, and they are, as such, they are reflective of their creators' objectives and strategies. They are reflective of the context where they were elaborated. They are reflective of the specificities of their business models. And also, very important, these platforms are embedded in power relations operating at various scales. And of course, they are also used in very specific local environments. And all these elements that are excluded in the previous approaches, perspectives quoted, have to be taken into account if we want to understand the role digital platforms play in the countries of the global south. These two perspectives have also another common weakness. They are presented as being brand new analysis on the brand new role played by digital platforms in the contemporary times. Yet they echo quite old and very well-known arguments. Larry Diamond, for example, reminds us of what Michel de Solapoul in the 70s and 80s told. He saw new technologies as technologies of freedom. And the same can be said about the celebration of ICTs as instruments of economic development. Yeah? This echoes the arguments of the modernization theorists, who from the late 50s on considered the media as key tools for national development. Interestingly, these two perspectives on platforms as instruments of democratization or of development are today highly criticized by the critical political economy of communication. The critical political economy of communications, the same that already a few decades ago already had played a key role in debunking the modernization thesis and the thesis of Michel de Solapoul. One of the main figures of the political economy of communications, having worked on the issues raised by the expansion of digital platforms in the global south, is Dal Yong-jin. He is famous for having coined the expression, the notion of platform imperialism. This notion is directly derived from the notion of cultural imperialism coined by Herbert Schiller in the mid-70s. The notion of platform imperialism aims at describing the dominant role the main US-based platform play in the global south. And for this, Dal Yong-jin underlines the fact that a handful of American-based platforms are dominant in the global internet markets. And he shows how this global expansion of US platforms has been greatly supported by the US government in the name of human rights and national US interests. As you see, there's a kind of updating of the good old doctrine of the free flow of information denounced by Herbert Schiller. And Dal Yong-jin explains then that this expansion of the global US platforms has cultural cultural consequences. Indeed, these technological platforms are not value neutral. They are carrying cultural values embedded in them. Their expansion leads then, in the opinion of Jean, to the propagation at a global scale of a form of symbolic hegemony. However interesting they may be, the arguments of Jean are worth discussing, at least for 2 points, in respect to 2 points, in relation to 2 points. First, Jean tends to have a top-down vision of the US-based platform global expansion. He does not pay sufficient attention to the important role played by local actors. Second, the geography of platforms that is sketched out by Jean is one where American platforms dominate without much competition. As he asserts, the major players are US-based platforms and they reign supreme in the platform market. But this is hotly debated, including within the field of the political economy of communication. Other authors think that, on the contrary, Chinese Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent now rival the US-based internet giants. Anyway, the rise of US platforms in the global South has contributed to the reappearance of a series of important debates that had been left unresolved in the 70s within the framework of the New World Information and Communication Order discussions. This is the case with the debates around the inequalities structuring the global market for digital cultural goods. And a report of Caribou Digital is interesting in this respect. It shows that the world economy of apps is dominated by 2 firms, Apple and Google, through their iOS or Android platforms. Moreover, it shows that the geography of app developers is heavily skewed towards the US app developers, who are the dominant producers, even if East Asian, especially Chinese app developers, play an increasing global role. Similarly, concerns have been raised on the detrimental impact that US-based platforms have on domestic cultural industries in the global South. And another report of Caribou Digital is interesting in this respect. It emphasizes some of the big issues raised by the key cultural intermediary role played by Facebook in emerging markets. Indeed, Facebook is accustoming its users in emerging markets to free content and services. And by doing that, it is depriving local publishers from potential revenues, while generating its own revenues thanks to its data extraction and advertising activities. Another familiar debate raised by the rise of US-based platforms is, of course, the debate on cross-border data flows. As Anika Gurumurthy has shown, current data regime favors the extraction of data for digital intelligence from the South by the corporations of the global North. And this brings us to another stream of critical research that has risen and which has resorted to the notions of colonialism or coloniality for depicting the digital platform's role in the global South. As Toussaint Notias noted, the increasing use of the notion of colonialism for characterizing the activities of these platforms, including in the global South, has coincided with the launch of a series of programs aiming at connecting those who are still unconnected in the global South. We are thinking here of the Google's project, Project Loon, Google Station, but also to the project Facebook, of Facebook Free Basics. These theses on data colonialism, on digital colonialism, go much further in the critique of the digital platforms than the platform imperialism thesis. Indeed, they suggest that there's a continuum between the contemporary activities of these platforms and those of the colonial powers some centuries ago. But of course, I will let you, Ulysses and Nick, introducing the stream of critical research. So, while all these researchers are very important for understanding the role of global digital platforms in the Global South, but these approaches, macro-level approaches, need also to be complemented by meso-level analysis, studying the lived experiences of those who use the platforms for producing and circulating cultural contents. These platforms, and more specifically social media platforms, have indeed offered at a global scale new spaces of expression and creation with a priori very low levels, very low barriers to entry, and so much spaces that have been seized by amateurs and professionalizing creators in each domestic market. Stuart Cunningham and David Craig go as far as to state that these content creators have given rise to an emerging proto-industry in the cultural field. And this has led Cunningham and Craig to claim that these social media platforms cannot be considered as another instance of Western cultural imperialism. On the contrary, they, in their opinion, social media platforms have to be seen as facilitators of creator and content in the many international markets in which they operate. To sum up their ideas, they argue that these platforms are agents of cultural diversity. But of course, their argument tends to paint a too rosy picture. Indeed, digital platforms are far from being only facilitators of content creation. They are also in each market where they are operating, they are also contributing to the restructuring of content creation. They are contributing to that by the norms they prescribe, by the injunctions they formulate in line with the objectives of their business models. A handful of studies have tackled this issue. In the special issue they edited on cultural industries and digital platforms in the Global South, Christine Ithurbide and Vasily Rivron have noted that these platforms have contributed to a renewal of the forms of work in the cultural fields. They have in particular promoted the figure of the creator entrepreneur for better, of course, in their own interest, for better monetizing the contents they produce. And these platforms have also, for the same reason, submitted the amateur, artisanal, or informal forms of cultural creation to the pressure of the increasing mercantile relations. And this is confirmed by a handful of other studies carried out outside the Western world. Arturo Arriagada and Francisco Ibanez, in their research on Chilean content creators in the field of fashion and lifestyle, highlight, for example, the intensified economic pressures exerted on these creators by Instagram. The creators they study must indeed produce ever more content, ever more frequently, for trying to satisfy the appetite of the algorithm. And this, as they note, reinforces such commercial aspects in creator activities. Finally, and it will be my last point, of course, for understanding the issues raised by the expansion of digital platforms in the Global South, it's also important to study how their consumers use their services. The first studies dealing with the use of digital platforms in the Global South were unwilling to take into consideration the fact that these platforms are socio-technical constructions. In his often quoted study of Facebook practices in Trinidad, Daniel Miller goes as far as to state that in this country, Facebook is only the aggregate of its regional and particular usage. In this context, of course, the global expansion of Facebook cannot be something else than constituting the source of new forms of cultural diversity. Daniel Miller also highlights another positive contribution of Facebook for its users in Trinidad. He argues that Facebook users in Trinidad now manage to live within a considerable richer social world than a few years ago. And this argument has been influential among the rare works that have researched the uses of US-based digital platforms in marginalized groups, social groups in the Global South. Nimi Rangaswamy and Payal Arora, for example, have studied how the youth living in slum communities in Hyderabad and Chennai use Facebook. And they show that these youth use Facebook as a way of trying to expand their social network far beyond their limited social capital. Through Facebook, these youth, they say, try friending people from an elevated social status to fulfill aspirations of social mobility. However, this use of Facebook as a means for trying to expand one's own social network, it's not without its limits. As Payal Arora states, by giving to young people who are living at the margins the means to travel the world, Facebook is also offering a pathway to envy and frustrated aspirations. The scant research that has been carried out on the use of global digital platforms in sub-Saharan Africa also highlight how these are used by their users, marginalized users, for improving their social condition. In the study of Facebook uses in an informal settlement in Nairobi, Susan Wish and her colleagues showed that their young respondents used Facebook for communicating with friends and family overseas, who are perceived as having more financial resources than local. They show also that Facebook is used in more prosaic ways for looking for formal or informal employment jobs opportunities, or for advancing their entrepreneurial efforts. All these findings are interesting because they underline a quite familiar seeming contradiction between the macro level analysis discussed above, which study the detrimental impact, the detrimental role played by digital platforms in the Global South, and the way in which, for many of its disadvantaged users in these countries, these platforms are viewed as a resource for enlarging their social imaginaries or even economic opportunities. However, this contradiction may be more apparent than real. Indeed, if these platforms are viewed as a resource by these users, it's also, at least in part, due to the strategies implemented by these platforms for exploiting the potential of these untapped markets. This shows how much important it is to try to combine macro level, meso level, and micro level analysis. Thank you for your attention. Christine, it's to you.
Yes. So thank you very much, Tristan. And what we said is that many of the different elements presented by Tristan could be indeed observed at several levels in the recent fieldwork we carried out with Philippe in India, and that probably most of you have also been observing through your respective fieldwork. We wanted to conclude this introduction by suggesting more specifically several tracks on which we have started to work, which seem to have been less studied. Here are some a list of a few idea tracks for reflection to be further explored during those 2 days, and that we wanted to share here with you. First of all, while general consideration exists on the way in which US platforms are deployed globally, few researches have been produced more specifically on the differentiated expansion strategies of those US platforms, the different strategies between them, but also in the different countries where they expand their activity. There is also little information on the active role that local actors play in the expansion of this global platform and on the role of actors from the margins. More study need to be carried at meso and micro level, as Tristan was really emphasizing, to enable to better identify processes of appropriation, alternative use, and even the circumvention of the logic of dependence. Further research would also be required on the financial presence of foreign players in national cultural industry and logic of oligopoly. More research is also on the international strategies of players other than the US ones, starting with the Chinese platform. Few elements also on the way in which the hegemonic relation generated by the platform are not only deployed in a perspective of north-south scale, but also between South countries themselves and even within same region and same country. And finally, too little information also on how the study of the platform in the global South allow criticism of platform in the North. So here are a diversity of elements we aim at discussing with you during those 2 days of the workshop. It will be structured around 3 sessions, with one starting just after our keynote speech from Nick Couldry and Ulysses Mejillas. The first session, we will detail it just after. Yeah, we'll start right now with the keynote speech. And thank you very much for being again here today with us.